Okay, so we're just about at the end of our net working capital section, and in this final video, I want to talk about the net working capital balance itself, and then more importantly, the net working capital target. So before we start, let's just save a new version like always. Call this the net working capital target. I'm just going to put down here net working capital, and then we'll put a 12-month target, 6-month target, and a 3-month target. So let's take a step back first. So what is net working capital? Well, net working capital effectively tells you the operating liquidity of a business, right? It's what makes the business function. So the company has to buy inventory, sell that inventory to its customers, then collect cash from those sales and pay that cash to its vendors for the inventory. So it's critical that the seller delivers an appropriate amount of net working capital to you, the buyer, so that you can run the business uninterrupted post-close. So in order to make sure that you as the buyer receive a fair or accurate amount of net working capital, this thing called the net working capital target or net working capital peg comes up. And for reasons I can't really explain, it doesn't tend to come up early in the deal. Usually it comes up later in diligence, things are moving along pretty well, and all of a sudden this extremely contentious hot button issue comes up of the net working capital target. So I think it's good to discuss it early on, and I want you to be aware of it early on because it can honestly be a massive black hole, and I encourage you to research it on your own time. The amount of information out there on this is overwhelming, but it's usually not spoken about when you talk about classic M&A transactions, at least at a high level. So this working capital target. So why does it exist? Well, one, the seller is expected to deliver a normalized level of working capital to support business operations post-closing, and that's what we talked about. And two, it's actually to prevent the seller from manipulating the net working capital during diligence. Now, you wouldn't think that that happens, but it can occasionally. So think about it like this. When you close the deal, the seller typically takes all of the cash on the balance sheet as part of their proceeds. So what the seller could do during diligence is accelerate all the receivables, stockpile the cash, and then stretch out all the vendors, leaving you, the buyer, with the bill. So the working capital target acts as a mechanism to make sure that everybody is playing by the same rules. And if the seller were to accelerate the receivables and stretch the payables like that, you would notice it in the model. So you can imagine that it's a pretty contentious issue because when you set the target, what happens is post-close, there's always a true-up. And what that means is relative to the target that was established, the actual net working capital that comes in is going to be different. It probably won't hit it dollar for dollar. So if the seller delivers more working capital to the buyer than the target, well, then the seller gets to keep that difference. And conversely, if they deliver less working capital than the target, well, then the seller has to give the difference back to the buyer. So just by nature, the seller is motivated to have a low target and the buyer is motivated to have a higher target. And then the second part that can make it even more contentious is, well, how do you calculate it? Do you calculate it on a 12-month basis, 6-month basis? Are there adjustments? What about the business cycle? Is it in growth mode? Is it more static? Is it declining? So you can see how there is so much nuance to this that it can become a pretty hotly debated topic as you get into diligence. So let's just build it, and then I think it'll start to make more sense as we look through the targets that we're going to build here. So thankfully in our model, the definition is pretty straightforward. It's the current assets minus the current liabilities. In diligence, again, you will have adjustments to all of these and maybe some other accounts so that everybody can agree on a true definition of what the working capital is for this deal. And often the QOV firm will help with that. For our model, it's just going to be this simple current asset, current liability calculation. So let's bring it out to the end of the historical period, and then let's take a look. So if you don't really have anywhere else to start, what's fairly industry standard, I would say, is just taking an average of the last 12 months. So let's start that over here, just like we have our gray filler for the turns calculation. Let's start here, and let's just build a rolling average of the last 12 months and drag that out. And then down here, let's build one for 6 months. So I'm going to take the average of the last 6, roll that out. And then here, let's do 3 months. So I'll take the average of the last 3 months, and I'll drag that out. So now at the end of our historical period here, well, we have 3 different working capital targets. On a 12-month basis, we've got 4.2. On a 6-month basis, we've got 4.4. And on a 3-month basis, we've got 4.5. So there's a difference here of about $300,000 just purely based on different averages that we used. So the seller might say, well, we should use a 12-month basis and get the target as low as possible. The buyer might say, well, no, we need to use a 3-month basis. The business is in high growth mode, and we need a higher target to support the higher operations. So what this is ultimately going to boil down to is you and your team need to discuss the best way that you want to calculate the target, what average period you want to use, and then you will ultimately need to collaborate with the seller on this. Personally, I find that rather than setting a very hard line, I like to use a bit of a collar. So let's just say we decided that our target was going to be the 6-month target. After exhaustive discussion with our team and some back and forth with the seller, I'd like to add a collar, or more simply put, a buffer. So let's just say it was a 10% buffer. I'm going to do 0.1, just format that as a percent. And then I'm going to take our 6-month target, and I'm going to multiply it times 1 plus the buffer, and then multiply it again times 1 minus the buffer. So now I have 2 different numbers here. And this is just another way that you can negotiate. So you could say, rather than having a hard line drawn in the sand here, why don't we all agree that as long as the working capital delivered is within 10% of the 6-month average, then there's no harm, no foul. The seller doesn't have to true up, and the buyer doesn't have to true up. I found that this approach tends to be received pretty well. It makes the entire process a little bit more collaborative, especially when you think about, well, who's the seller? Well, in a private equity deal, most likely that seller is part of your team post-close, and it's better to get off on the right foot together and collaborate on something as opposed to arguing to it tooth and nail just to then become teammates a few days later. So again, this will be entirely contingent upon your team, how they like to do this, how they've done deals in the past, and how people have been burned on this. Everybody's going to have their own anecdote, and ultimately it will boil down to what works best for your firm. So we don't need to establish any kind of collar in this model. So I'm just going to delete this. What's really important here is that you are aware of the working capital target. It's something that tends to come up later in diligence, and it can be a really combative issue. So as you're building your model now, just start thinking of it as you go. So just to make this formatting a little bit more clear, put some borders around this. Here's our net working capital, and these are just some potential unadjusted targets, but they are things to keep in mind as we progress through the deal. And then for here in the annual section, well, we can just copy this here. And then for the targets, we can just use the index match function and paste it so we can see what they were at that time, and then copy the formats like we've done in other videos. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too confusing. Again, the net working capital and the net working capital target can be extremely tricky. I encourage you to research it on your own time. I know that I spent hours and hours looking into this, and I still find it confusing to this day, and I will always research it and refresh my own memory when I'm building these models or when we're in negotiation on a deal and this topic of the target comes up. Okay, so I think we're going to call it here. That is the end of the net working capital section, and we're going to move on to finish out the balance sheet from here.